What's up, everyone? This is Bree here, and you are listening to episode 12 of the Comics and Whatnot podcast, Emerald Twilight Comic Review. Hey, everybody, what is up? It's your favorite podcast person, Bree here, and I'm back for another episode of Comics and Whatnot. I hope you're all doing super well, and I hope summer is going great for all of you, especially since, admittedly, quite a bit of time has passed since the last episode that I've done, and this is, again, I've done this before, but you know what? I'm sure you're all very tired of hearing the same excuse, because I've gone on a few prolonged podcast vacations and breaks at this point, but you know what? Sometimes that's what summer does to people, it makes them relax just a little bit too much to the point where they just go away, and sometimes they don't come back for a while, so that kind of happened to me. I think it had been like either 2 months or 3 months or a few months. I don't really even know anymore, but I know I'm sick of hearing myself apologizing for not being on time, so, but besides being the podcast where I kind of just post episodes whenever the urge hits, this show, Comics and Whatnot, is also the lovely top-notch podcast where all geeky topics reign proud and true, and where we reminisce not only about comics and pop culture TV in general, but also dive into the depths and archives of DC's greatest hits. And so, if that doesn't tell you enough, today we are knocking another DC-themed episode off the list, because I love DC and it's time. It's been a while since I've done DC-themed stuff. So we are going to do some DC today. And speaking of DC, this episode is all about one of the most, if not the most, spectacular and highly acclaimed Green Lantern story of all time, which, of course, is Emerald Twilight, and that was written by Ron Marz. And with this comic, I've really been wanting to sit down and ramble about it for a while now. And you guys might remember way back from the My Hero Academia review episode, I mentioned it very briefly at the end, but now we're actually reviewing it, so now it's definitely time to dive into it. And a big part of why I want to talk about this comic specifically so much is because, one, it's obviously really good, and I'm sure you've guessed that just because of how I'm talking about it, and two, Emerald Twilight really has a special place in my heart. And it actually was the first Green Lantern comic I had ever read. In the myriad of comics I've read at this point, that was the first Green Lantern one. And at the point that I had read Emerald Twilight, I was fairly new to reading comics at the time. Not, completely new, but I had a few things under my belt at the time. And it was back at the time where I could actually count the amount of comics I had read. Now I have absolutely no clue. I just stopped counting because you can't even remember at this point. But I used to be able to count. So when I could, this was one of the newer things I had come across, and it did not disappoint at all. It was so good, and I am so glad that I had read this comic, because it ended up being one of my very favorite Green Lantern stories of mine, and a very important piece of the DC comic puzzle that I'm still trailing down to this day. I'm kind of doing a lead up, like a reading order, all the way leading up to Sinestro Corpse War, and it's supposed to be going in order, so in timeline order. So right now I'm at the Green Lantern, kind of oriented time in DC Comics, when it was really good. So I still have a lot of the way to go, but Emerald Twilight really starts everything. So I love it so much, and most DC fans love it so much too. It's very highly acclaimed, and this is one of the DC comic greats that have gone down in the comic archives of history. This is the type of comic that if you go to the comic book store and you ask about Green Lantern, this is what the comic guy is going to recommend to you. So I'm really excited to break it down for you all today. But, for those of you who have never read this before, I would love to give you some background, because you kind of need, you kind of need a little bit of background for this, or background would be nice before you jump into this comic. Plus, I'm sure you figured this out by now, but it goes without saying that, obviously, this review is going to contain spoilers, so I usually would mention this, more urgently, as its own, this is a spoiler review. But this has literally been out for decades. Like, it's pretty, I don't want to say old because, like, it's going to be like, oh, you're a kid. But it kind of is old, so it's been out for a really long time. So at this point, I mean, you either read it or you don't, but if you're good with spoilers, then you'll be fine. But anyways, basically, the whole context of Emerald Twilight is it picks up right after the end of Superman, Reign of the Superman, or the Death of Superman. So basically, you had Superman, the Death of Superman, and then the Reign of the Superman. So after the Reign of Superman, you had Emerald Twilight. So what happens is Mongol, which is this villain in, the whole Death of Superman thing, he is a villain, not the villain, but anyway, he goes to this city because he wants to, like, implant some alien technology into the city and kind of expand or create War World, which is, like, literally a world of war. I didn't really need to explain that. But he wanted to create it on Earth somewhere, and he wanted to use a city called Coast City as his hub. And Coast City is the hometown of Green Lantern Hal Jordan. So they had this whole thing where Hal Jordan showed up. So Mongol is causing issues, and Green Lantern shows up. So in Emerald Twilight, you kind of see that Mongol has decimated the entire city. Like, everybody was killed. It kind of was just, like, completely crushed. And Green Lantern is really in a bad spot because of it, because it was his hometown. He's, like, very mentally disrupted and just not in a good state of mind. So that's kind of where we leave off on that. But if you've never read this, that's actually okay. And if you've never read Reign of the Superman and Death of Superman, it's a lot to read beforehand. So I wouldn't say that you have to read Death of Superman, Reign of the Superman to get Emerald Twilight. But even if you haven't read all of that, it's okay, because this comic was really intended to bring in a lot of new DC comic readers at the time. So it was the end of an era and the start of another time for comics and stuff. So it's a really great jumping on point. So I wouldn't say that you have to do a lot of pre-reading. You can kind of just jump into this. But that's some of the context of Emerald Twilight when it's starting. So, all right. I would love to talk about some great things about this comic. Let's just dive right in there, talk about some of the strong points. I love talking about the art as one of the first things, because that's obviously when you read a comic book, that's one of the first things that you notice. And for the art, so in terms of comic books, I think that my favorite type of art is more like when art started getting digitized in comics. So maybe or when it's just like it looks smoother, like stuff like Flashpoint and like Batman Hush, like when the art kind of started looking different. So this art type is not my favorite type. It's not my favorite, but I really, 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 really love it. And I totally forget the name of the artist. Let me just look it up before I forget so I can give credit to this guy. Let's see. It was drawn by Daryl Banks. So it's definitely different, it's a way different style of art than what we get now in comic books, which is it's a different type of feel. But I really like it here. It was very well done. The colors are so bright and everything's I don't know, it just feels crisp at the same time as I don't know how to describe it, but it looks really beautiful and I really like it for this story. So Daryl Banks did a really great job of the art in this comic. So I will say it's not my absolute favorite. I have certain favorites, certain favorite types of comic art, but it was really good for this comic. So yeah, but then besides art, diving into actual content, this is the pinnacle, a really great example of a story of what it looks like when a superhero goes insane. And it's so uncommon and unique because it takes the one superhero everybody thought could do no wrong, this guy, Hal Jordan, who was so, on a high pedestal by the time this story was written. Everybody loved Hal Jordan. He was the one Green Lantern that it was nobody can touch him. He's this great person, and he's this great character. But it was so crazy how this story turned him into basically the villain. The good guy turns bad, and there's always going to be something about that type of story that really never gets old and always has value, when that one character you never thought could do wrong does wrong, and I think that this type of story, it has something that people just can't resist. I always compare stories like this to what happened to Anakin in Star Wars. They're same in the sense where Anakin was, obviously the Jedi that nobody thought could do anything wrong. He was like the best of the best, and this is what Hal Jordan is. He's the best of the Green Lanterns. But obviously what happens with Anakin is he turns to the dark side. He has a weakness, and that's what makes him, kind of go off the rails. And that's really what happens with Hal Jordan too. He's this great character, but once, his home gets destroyed, and what he tries to do is he tries to recreate everything, the whole city, with his power ring. And once the Guardians, the little blue people of the Green Lantern Corps tell him that that's not allowed, he kind of loses it. And he's like, I will do anything to bring my people back and bring the city back. And that's kind of what makes him go on this crazy rampage and turn bad and do anything. He's willing to do anything to make this happen. And it really, the more that I'm saying it, the more it really does sound like Anakin, because that's really what happened to him. He was like, I will do anything to save the one person that I care about, and that includes turning to the dark side, and that's how we get Darth Vader. So there's something about the recipe for what makes a good guy a villain that is so, attention-catching and so thrilling. So I really, really like how that was done here, and this is a really great example of that type of story. And, when you say villain in this sense, the word villain itself gets really dicey to use, because it really boils down to a person who has good intentions but just has a twisted mindset, and that's what happens to Hal. And even later down the line, this is in another really good story, another really good Green Lantern story called Ion, with Kyle Rayner, which we'll talk about Kyle Rayner in a minute. He's faced with a similar decision later on in his own series where, somebody that he cares about dies, and he wants to bring her back to life with the power ring, but it's just wrong. He was in a good place about it. He wanted to bring his mom back, but it was kind of it just wasn't right, So that's kind of what was happening here when Hal was trying to bring back the people from his town with the power ring. It was you're noble for wanting to remember them, but it was kind of twisted, and it just didn't feel right what he was trying to do. So that's kind of Hal's turn and destruction, and his kind of fall from being a hero, which was really, really, really well done in this story. So that's one of the main factors of this book, is that such a decorated hero becomes the villain. But also, the other half of the story has such a lasting impact as well, because not only does this fallen hero fall, but it's also the emergence of a new hero from the ashes of that fallen hero. And that person is no other than the great Kyle Rayner, and he's one of the favorites. He's one of the Green Lantern favorites that he's just so, holy. And many people say that because of this story, Kyle Rayner is the Green Lantern that they grew up with, because, again, this is the end of the era, basically, of Hal Jordan, and then the birth of a new era of a new hero, which is Kyle Rayner. And he's become everybody's favorite just because he's so darn cool, and his backstory really is something. Personally, I grew up with Hal Jordan, even though I was, aware of DC material well after Kyle Rayner had come to the picture. So, yeah, I grew up with Hal Jordan, but Kyle Rayner was very much in the picture at the time. But a lot of people knew most of him just because of Kyle Rayner kind of took the place of Hal Jordan for a while after he, kind of turned. But Kyle's backstory in this is very much, you can't have Kyle without Hal, which is really cool to think about, but you can't have him without Hal making a mistake. But basically his backstory is, so Hal goes crazy trying to get this power from his ring so that he can recreate his city that has been decimated. And so Hal eventually gets to the Green Lantern core, where all the power comes from, and he, like, kind of kills everyone. He kills all the little blue people who control the power. But this one blue guy who survives, he's trying to save what is left and, have something to pass on the whole Green Lantern Corps to, because Hal has basically destroyed everything. And the first person that he sees and finds is Kyle. So now you have this person who has so much power and potential, and this literally the most powerful weapon in the universe, and he doesn't have anybody to train from, to learn from, to teach him, and he doesn't really even know what to do with it much. But eventually he comes around and he starts to try to get the hang of it, and everything is going great. And he's using the Green Lantern ring, and he's thinking, I can use it to be a hero and get money and whatever. So he's having fun with it. But then eventually a villain who had fought with Hal Jordan mistakes Kyle for being Hal, and he comes after him thinking that he's somebody else. And his girlfriend is tragically killed as being associated with him and being associated with a Green Lantern name. And so his backstory really, it starts off like, oh, this is kind of cool, like this new Green Lantern guy he's the only Green Lantern left, but it really turns tragic very, very fast. And I think that the tragedy of Kyle's backstory and origin really is another recipe for a really great character. And everyone knows that a well-bred character has to go through some sort of pain in order to have real depth. And one of my very favorite examples in this case would be Daredevil. Daredevil's my favorite, one of my favorite characters of all time. But he is my favorite because he goes through so much crazy stuff all the time. All the way from, like, the classic superhero beginning to where, his dad was killed. But most of the time, he's going through the craziest, hardest things ever in the comics and on, in the TV show. But the greatest characters go through pain all the time. And Kyle's story actually made me really sad, which is a really good sign when you're reading an origin story for someone, because that means that it's well constructed from the foundation. So what happens is once Kyle's girlfriend is tragically killed, after everything's happy-go-lucky and everything's going great, and then you get this tragic death, it's sad, but then to see him become a hero who gets to the top, but not without suffering a few things, I think that's really important for a hero to face and to make a hero. And Emerald Twilight did an amazing, amazing job at that. And even after, his girlfriend dies and after he gets this power, Kyle ends up facing so much more tragedy after this, because literally every woman or girl that he's ever liked or cared about in his life dies like 3 times over. So it really gets the message through about pain. But I think that this is one of the things that makes Kyle so great, besides just being cool and this really cool character, alone. But the fact that he comes from, like, humbler beginnings and has suffered, I think that says a lot about why people like him so much. So I think the main couple things that make Emerald Twilight such a valuable Green Lantern read is not only because it adds so much to the whole Green Lantern story in general, but it shows, the downfall of one of the favorites, Hal Jordan, and it shows how he kind of loses his mind. But at the same time, it brings to light a whole other hero who rises from the ashes of that and, also becomes a favorite in the process. So for those reasons, I think that's what makes Emerald Twilight so, so great. So I love it. It's really amazing. So those are some of my favorite things about it. I don't really have that much to say about things that weren't as great, but one of the things that DC always does with their comics is that they will have stories like Emerald Twilight where, like, major things happen, but somewhere down the line, they somehow find a way to undo everything that was done. So one of my favorite things about this comic is how much damage and destruction that Hal Jordan left in his trail. And they really don't hold back from it or try to sugarcoat it, which is what I don't like, is when they like have people and characters pulling their punches when they can really just let it loose. But in this case, Hal Jordan just lets everything loose, and he's like killing people to try to get this power, that I keep mentioning. And what was really striking to me was that Hal was willing to kill people that he knew and that he was friends with, and characters that I recognized. So characters that he had years of development with, like Tomar Ray and Kilowog and Sinestro and, the little blue people that control the power. He was like ripping through all of them, during this whole thing, during the whole comic. And not to mention a bunch of other Green Lanterns too. So, and he was like, his hands were bloody, man. Like he put himself in a really bad position where he was kind of becoming a murderer. But the sad thing is, when they make drastic killing-offs of important characters by other important characters, somehow it gets canceled out by half-witted, not as good resurrections of these same characters in between major events. So what happens with this is, yes, all of these characters Hal Jordan kills, and Hal Jordan goes insane. But somewhere down the line, it's all undone, and people just get resurrected out of nowhere. And I'm just like, I felt something when these characters died, but now that they're kind of just being brought back half-wittedly and not as like much effort involved, bringing them back, it's a little annoying that we can't keep the drastic effects of what was beautifully accomplished here forever, But then again, I'm not sure if I'd necessarily want all of these characters to stay dead because like really important people kind of died, so you can't have. At the same time, you can't kill off everyone, but when it happens and it makes you feel something, it's kind of like annoying that it has to be undone at some point. So that kind of takes away the dramatics and the feelings that you would probably get when you see somebody die now, because that's at some point that just means they're going to resurrect them. But every franchise does something like this where, people die and they come back. Marvel and DC are most known for that. So, like, especially in the comics, I'm really just talking about comics with this. But, so yeah, you really can't go without it forever, without things being undone in future comics. But that's my only complaint, really, about this. And just one other thing, this isn't really, like, necessarily bad about the, Emerald Twilight, but this was something that I kind of mentioned a little bit towards the beginning, is that to get the full picture of this and going into it, you'd feel better reading this whole big story of the Death of Superman comic event, which happens like before this and leads right into it, but it is a hefty event to get through. Like, if you were to see the Reign of Superman book, or if you have ever seen it, it is a fat boy. Like, it is big. So, like, that would just really tire you out, thinking that I have to read this in order to get the full picture. But again, this is another thing that DC always does. But you can't really help having comics relate to each other over the years, but it is kind of tiring. I didn't even know that they connected. I had just happened to read this Reign of Superman, and then I was like, oh, Emerald Twilight, and then I was like, oh my gosh, they connect. But yeah, they fill you in the blanks along the way, and they help you understand what happened with Mongol and what he did to Coast City, etc. But I was really glad I had read it already. But if you haven't, and you're that type of like completist person who's like, I need to know everything, that would be a little bit time consuming to get through all of that first. If you have the time, I would definitely recommend it. But that's another thing. It's kind of a lengthy consecutive reading order just for lead up. But yeah, it's right before it, so that's another only thing that I have to say. But if you do end up doing that, I don't think you'll regret it because it really helps, but you don't have to necessarily. But that's just a little bit, like, it's a lot. Like, it's a little bit of work, involved. But really, that's nothing against the actual Emerald Twilight comic itself. Even just saying that what happens in it is undone later on, like, that's nothing against Emerald Twilight. So I really don't have anything to say bad towards Emerald Twilight. I think it's that good, honestly. Like, I can't think of anything bad about it. But, yeah, I just wanted to talk more about, since there's nothing bad to talk about it, just to go deeper into, like, the character development of what happens here. Because, like, in terms of character development, I think this is probably one of the best examples to exhibit growth in a DC book. I don't know, like, a lot of DC books do show character development, but I think this is one of the best examples of that. Because on one end, we have Kyle Rayner, who went from just being a regular kid off the street with no money and girlfriend issues to being the last dying ember of this huge, most powerful weapon holders club, basically. So he changes in that way, where it's just him from going to a place where he has no responsibility to having, like, one of the greatest responsibilities to making sure that this group never dies, and to make sure that this hope of Green Lantern-ism, I guess, never dies. So I guess that's a really good example of character development on Kyle's part, which is, it's cool to be able to show character development for this character that is being introduced, like, that we just met, like, 2 seconds ago. So if you can do that, I think that's a really good start anyway, like, showing development for somebody that we just met. And on the other side of things, we have, again, Hal Jordan, who went from being the most trusted, beloved, valued, and strong-willed hero to being a mentally wrecked, twistedly driven, fallen king. So it's really two sides of the same coin, but they're both showcased so perfectly side by side together. We have the development that's, like, going from down to up, kind of, like, gets kind of, like, promoted a little bit with some pain along the way, and then we have another hero who goes from being on the top of the mountain to, like, rock bottom in, like, 2 seconds. So yeah, it's two sides of the same coin, but really beautifully done side by side, and I loved it so much, and they're such great compliments to each other. And so in terms of the ending, with a comic this good, you need a great ending to finish it off, and not just something, like, nice to wrap it up, but something to leave room and pave the way for more stuff. Because this comic isn't the end, it's the end to, like, an era, but it's really the beginning of, Kyle Rayner and him being the Green Lantern, and the beginning of us seeing where Hal Jordan goes and what he does after this. So you kind of need an ending to tell you that, yes, bad things happened and we're kind of in shambles, but there is more to be done, and this is going to continue somewhere else. So basically the ending begins with Kyle Rayner's girlfriend's killer. He catches up with his girlfriend's killer. This guy, what is his name? Oh my gosh, I literally know I forget the name of this villain at this particular moment, the name of the killer. But this guy who has created such a vile murder of the one person Kyle cared about and was willing to share his power with is in his grips, and Kyle is, like, torturing him, And this is another painfully good thing. Like, good as in, like, this is, like, a good element of the story. But this is something that, we see heroes face the decision a lot, what to do when they get the instigator of their pain, and basically whether they want to kill this person or not. And another great example that, obviously always comes to mind for me is Batman. This happens to Batman too, which, again, recipe for a great character because everybody loves Batman. But eventually in the comics, this happens a few times in the shows and in this particular comic that I'm thinking about too. I think in Batman 3 Jokers, Batman eventually catches up with this guy, Joe Chill, who is the one who killed his parents and, started the road to him eventually becoming Batman. But he's, basically started this horrible life of pain for him. But yeah, it's another great element of a hero is, it also counts as, like, going through pain, but once they catch up to the person who kind of started them on that road, what to do. And that also shows a lot of growth too. So that's where we're at. So while Kyle has this person in his grips and he's torturing this guy, the police stop him. But but I'm pretty sure he was going to kill the guy, just saying. Like, I thought he was going to. But yeah, the police stop him. But after that, he kind of just runs off, and he's like, okay, he kind of just abandons the scene he left. And after that, he's alone, and he's upset about everything, you know, because his girlfriend was just, like, freshly murdered. So he's upset. And what better way for a hero to receive comfort and counsel by means of the cameo of another classic hero? And in this case, that is my boy, Alan Scott. So, if you don't know who Alan Scott is another Green Lantern who is from another Earth. So, Hal Jordan did not murder him. He was still left alive, but he knows something is seriously wrong and that the Green Lantern Corps is left in complete ruins. So, he comes and pays Kyle a visit, and Kyle's upset, so he kind of has to, like, calm him down. He, like, slaps him against the wall and explains to him the entire history that he now has carrying on his shoulders. In this cameo, when Alan is talking to Kyle, I really, really like this part. One reason, just because I haven't seen too much of Alan Scott in the comics. I haven't seen that much of him showing up in places, you know, all the time, but I really just love this character. So any more stuff with him in it is great. But the other reason why I really like this part too with this conversation is because it actually filled me in on a lot of other Green Lantern information that I actually didn't know about. So it kind of informs you at the same time. But thirdly, love this part as well. Mostly this is the reason why I love it, is because this heart-to-heart between such an experienced Green Lantern and the inexperienced Green Lantern really brings to light the weight that Kyle has on his shoulders, and that he's really now the last member of the Green Lantern Corps who is either alive or sane. So this is really important to keep in mind for the future Green Lantern comics to come, because that is referenced a lot, and it's just expanded on from here. So another reason why this comic's so important, but yeah, I love this little cameo that we have here. And then after the Alan Scott visit, we are left with a lonely Kyle talking to himself, really, about the importance of using this gift that he has I don't know if unwillingly is the right word, because he accepted it, but unexpectedly received. He's talking about the importance of using this unexpectedly received gift to help others, and what his girlfriend would have wanted. And usually, like, monologues I find very corny in comics, but I think that this one perfectly wraps up the comic while leaving us hopeful for Kyle's future as a new Green Lantern in a dangerous world, and also anticipating what he's going to do about Hal Jordan on the loose, because he's still around and he's still kind of going crazy and doing his own thing. So, and that eventually gets confronted. I actually haven't read where they face off, but it does happen. But yeah, we're left at the end with all of that going through our minds. And all in all, though, I was truly blown away by the end of this comic story. I remember reading his little monologue and just kind of just being even more sad, because it makes you more sad. Him talking by himself and just talking about all the bad things that has happened to him, and, you know, he knows what he has to do now with his power. And I remember having finished reading it and immediately, like, raving to my dad about how awesome it was, because I really just wanted to talk about it with someone. It was that good. Like, I just had to, like, blurt something out after I had read it. It was so amazing. I was a combination of shocked from what Hal Jordan did, sad from what happened to Kyle, and then just eager to read the next Green Lantern-related thing. And I think if a comic does any of those emotions for you, let alone all three in one, being shocked, sad, and, like, excited to read whatever's next, that's a good comic book. So yeah, and for some reason, I love feeling sad at the end of a comic book. Like, to me, that's just a sign that it was, like, amazing and very well written, because it makes you feel something. But yeah, if it does any of those for you, I think it's a keeper, and this one certainly does the trick. So, Emerald Twilight is a keeper. Really, everything was done right. What I loved about it as well is that you couldn't tell what was going to happen in one issue to the next. You know, it was not like that predictable, like, mediocre story where it's like, oh, I've heard this a million times before. It was a really special story that I'll always have a soft spot for, and I'll always recommend to people. If anybody ever asks me about what can I read that's Green Lantern, I have not gotten that question yet from people that I know. But if I ever do, I'll be ready to spit this one out as a recommendation. So, yeah, it was very well paced. It was very, it had you on the edge of your seat, I feel like. And it was just done right. So, all in all, after all of that being said, I want to give my personal rating on this on a scale of 1 to 10. Now, with comics, sometimes it's hard to kind of gauge where it is on a scale of 1 to 10, but with this one, it's not that hard because it was just so good. So, I think all in all, I will give this book a rating of 9.5. And it's only missing the 0.5 just for the sake of the fact that it's not my all-time favorite DC comic. Like, taking into account everything else that I've read. It's, like, one of my favorite Green Lantern comics, like, if we just isolate Green Lantern DC-related things. But, like, in terms of every DC comic that I've ever read, this is not my favorite. I have other favorites, which I'll do reviews on those as well. But that's really where the 0.5 is. So, in terms of all DC comics I've come across, I'll say 9.5. But for all Green Lantern stuff, I will give it a solid 10. That is no doubt, no problem. So yeah, I'll give this, let's just say it's a 10. So yeah, Emerald Twilight, all in all, you get a 10. And it was such an amazing read. I think I sat down and I read this in one day. And like the comics that I do that for, like, are favorites of mine. So it was that gripping where I was like, I gotta read this like now. You know what I mean? So plus I still think about it. Because I'm reading a lot of Green Lantern stuff right now, and it has a lot to do with that, so it connects very well into other things. Yeah, man, Emerald Twilight, bro, you gotta pick this up. So yeah, but you know what, my friends? That was an awesome reviewing of Emerald Twilight, and it was really fun doing that with all of you today. But that should just about do it for this episode. A little bit shorter than usual. Like, usually the episodes would run into longer than an hour. But I tried a little bit different formatting today of how I review things, and it kind of cut it short. So that's kind of good, though. But it went really well, and I really enjoyed talking about this comic with you guys a little bit more unscripted. So if you enjoyed the review today and would like to see more content like this, maybe sooner rather than later instead of me waiting months in advance, please be sure to like and subscribe to the Comics and Whatnot YouTube channel and Facebook page, so you get updated whenever I make new stuff. And don't forget to leave a review on iTunes or Spotify or wherever else you listen to your podcasts, and mention how awesome you think the show is, because I think you do think it's awesome, because it is. So, and also, if there's any comic or TV show or movie that I haven't gotten the chance to review yet, that you would like to get mentioned and want to spread the word about, which honestly, that isn't narrowing the field down much because this is only episode 12. So if you could pick something like besides the 12 things I've already reviewed, or if you want to pick something I've already reviewed, whatever. There's no limits here. You can please write your own review about it, and send it over to comicsandwhatnotpodcast@gmail.com, and I would love to read it on the show and give you a shout out, because who doesn't love shout outs? Come on. And of course, once again, thank you so much for tuning into the show and taking some time out of your no doubt busy lives and busy schedules to listen to my rinky-dink comic review show here. Listen to me to ramble about Green Lantern, Emerald Twilight stuff. And I really appreciate it. Happy summer. Have a great rest of your summer. And I'll be talking more comics and whatnot with you guys soon. Bye.